Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our colloquium. Um, my name is Shoma Chaudhary. I'm one of the co-directors for the Center for Gender in Global Context. I'm the director of global research. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Mary Morash. Dr. Morash is professor in criminal justice and university distinguished professor at Michigan State University. Her research on women has been supported by 4 NSF grants, 2 grants from the National Institute of Justice, and a grant from the Michigan State University Foundation. Her focus has been on women as victims and as individuals who's been processed in the criminal legal system. She has been affiliated with the GenCen ever since its beginning 18 years ago. And before that, with the Women's Studies program at Michigan State University. Dr. Morash received a mentoring award and is a fellow at the American Society of Criminology, as well as the Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Society's Division of Women and Crime and Division on People of Color and Crime. And if I may add, Dr. Morash throughout her career has mentored hundreds of students and faculty, including myself. So today, Dr. Morash is going to talk about her most current research, which is the book that has been published by the University of California Press, and it's called In a Box. And In a Box draws on experiences of over 100 Michigan women on probation or parole to analyze how remnants of old-style supervision and policies that structure mental health services and housing availability, welfare, and employment opportunities hampered the state's effort at gender-responsive reforms in community supervision. Excuse me. The book narrates the stories of women and reveals how countervailing influences kept reform-oriented probation and parole agents and women they supervise in a box, limited their abilities to break away from punitive framework that has become common in the US criminal legal system. The book concludes with recommendations for truly effective reforms inspired by interviewees' reflections on their own experiences. Thank you so much. And with this introduction, I'm going to hand over it to Dr. Morash. Thank you.
So thank you, Shoma, and the GenCen staff. I really appreciate this opportunity to share the women's stories who contributed to this book. I do want to thank several people or agencies, National Science Foundation, the Michigan State University Research Foundation, which gave us an early strategic partnership grant, the Michigan Department of Corrections, which gave us unprecedented access to the clients that they supervise and also to the probation and parole agents, and especially the women who shared their stories that provided the foundation for this book. I do want to give you a little background on the probation and parole structure in Michigan. Every state is unique in how they structure probation and parole supervision. In Michigan, the Department of Corrections, which is a state agency, provides supervision for all people convicted of a felony. And that's probation supervision for people who have not been sent to prison, but instead they were put on probation, community supervision, and also parole supervision, which is for people who are coming out of prison. And the Michigan Department of Corrections also operates the prisons. For people convicted of lesser crimes, misdemeanors, court jurisdictions at the local level also have probation departments, and they're completely separate from the Michigan Department of Corrections operations. County sheriffs are responsible for jails, which hold people before conviction or sentenced to a year or less, usually for misdemeanors. District court judges handle misdemeanor cases. Circuit court judges handle felony cases. And the reason this becomes important is that people can be on both local probation supervision and have a Michigan Department of Corrections agent at the very same time. The reforms that took place in Michigan gave me an unprecedented opportunity to look at what happens when a department does something good. These reforms were driven by bureaucratic activists, people inside the Michigan Department of Corrections who wanted to make changes in general and also wanted to make woman responsive reforms. And these reforms started about 2010, and our study started shortly after that. Some of the things they did is they moved to a system of assessing risks and especially needs that included trauma history, current post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, measures of financial need that included items relevant to women. For example, they were the sole supporter for children. And these are needs that are quite specific to women. They do occur with men, but certainly not with the same kind of prevalence. They also instituted women-specific caseloads with agents trained to supervise women and focus specifically on their needs. Department-wide for both men and women, they use collaborative case management, which simply is just using evidence-based methods to meet people's needs. They also have trained all of their agents in motivational interviewing, which involves establishing some common goals between the agent supervising the person and that person, and structuring interactions around achieving those goals. And also, Michigan, for both positive reasons and practical financial reasons, for decades actually, has been trying to reduce prison populations. So at the Michigan Department of Corrections, a major goal is keeping people out of prison, not sending them back. After I finished this study, there has been additional reform by bureaucratic activists. They've increased the motivational interviewing training so all staff receive it, no matter what kind of job they have. Part of the academy, which they call the new agent school, also makes sure that everybody gets training in collaborative case management and women responsive approaches. Statewide, it used to be that adulthood started at 17, so somebody could go to jail or prison at 17, but that has been raised to age 18. And I put in parentheses there, is that enough? We know that sort of continuous transition to adulthood actually continues till age 26. In 2021, there have been new laws that reduce charges to people for not paying what they owe the courts. And also there have been 20 jail reform bills passed, which try to keep people out of jails. So as I talk about some examples of what happened to women in my study, it's possible these things are no longer happening at the rate that they were happening before. It remains to be seen how effective these reforms were. And also, it used to be people were charged $135 to be supervised, $135 a month for their probation and parole supervision. And that has been reduced to $30 a month. And this is, it's still quite expensive for people living on very low incomes, but it is an improvement. So we do have some evidence that these reforms really worked. Here, the right-hand side shows a large number of people who were supervised, of women, a larger number than the 118 the book is based on, agreed that their agents were caring, trustworthy, and non-punitive. And so just empirically, there does seem to be a real effect. And I did another study recently and rechecked this, and it's pretty much the same, despite the pandemic and all kinds of things that disrupted supervision. So that seems to be an effective reform, at least with quantitative data. We collected qualitative data from the 118 women, and what they told us are things like they really appreciated that their agents understood the constraints imposed by neighborhood crime, child care and family care responsibilities, mental illness, and addiction, all problems that are extremely prevalent with women. They also appreciated that agents acted as coaches as they dealt with the courts, child protective services, and they acted as advocates. The qualitative data showed that the agents were active in referring and advocating as new problems came up over time during the supervision period. And they coached and handled, they coached people to handle multiple agent supervision. Because you can imagine how complex that is if you are on parole for one thing in a local court, and then you're on parole for something else at the state level. And so it's very hard to deal with all of these different types of supervision. The agents, our qualitative data showed, also help women build networks of support. They ran women's groups at the reporting centers. They connected them to multiple programs to help them. And they gave them strategies for connecting to supportive people. And generally, they provided a great deal of support, informational, emotional, and esteem support. So this is a story about women and their dealings with multiple agencies, policies, programs, institutions, and residential settings. And so it's very complex. They might be on probation and parole in two different places. It was a period during the beginning of this study when they had drastically cut welfare in Michigan. So safety net programs were lacking. They're still lacking, housing shortages, that kind of thing. Mental health treatment, they have to seek outside. They come from small towns, big cities, other smaller post-industrial cities, and the problems in those particular areas. And they often seek substance abuse treatment. So they're basically managing not just to deal with supervision on probation and parole, but to deal with these multiple different agencies. A little bit about the 118 women who contributed to this book by telling their life stories. They had already been interviewed 3 times in person. We only interviewed women on probation and parole who had some drug involvement. Most were users, a few were only selling or making meth or other drugs. And the reason for that is that's most of the women on probation and parole at the state level. There are women, of course, who are purely economically motivated, white collar offenders, people who commit fraud, but that's a much smaller number who are in the system, and that's a whole different sort of set of circumstances. So we concentrated on those who were drug involved. And by the time they told their life stories to an interviewer, they really knew the project well. They had been interviewed 3 times in person, as I said, and then a 4th time by phone. And here are some of the things that they said about being in the research, which gives you a sense of the quality of the data we were able to collect. The researchers, got some good people on here. I could feel the heart of the last person who interviewed me. I know you're not judging me at all. You care about my well-being. I can tell you're compassionate and you really listen, and that means a lot. Now, we did have a few women who were non-cooperative or didn't feel comfortable revealing a lot about their stories. But this was the general kind of relationship our interviewers had with the women. I'm going to just say a few things about the problems that were apparent. A huge proportion of the women were girls who lived on their own, sometimes starting at age 12 or 13. Many were pushed out of schools, suspended, expelled, or just ignored when they disappeared. Many experienced childhood sexual abuse, and family, police, courts didn't believe when they reported. Safety net benefits, often, if they got them, like if they got welfare support, they ended up going to pay for maintaining local district courts. Jails and prisons are overcrowded. Mental health care was fairly readily available while people were under supervision, but then they went back into the general pool of the population, and there are shortages in Michigan. And I can't stress enough, data was collected during a period of welfare cutbacks, just absence of safety net benefits, and what continues, which is employment being difficult to get because of stigma of being convicted. I would suggest, if you're interested in this, you Google my name. You don't have to write this down, but we have posted everything we've published on women, and now we're starting to study men on probation and parole. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move to a couple stories that I want to share. Need to reach my notes. So,
Mary, may I just interrupt for
yes.
half a minute? I'm going to post the link of your website, if it's okay with you, to our
Oh, of
chat.
course.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to do is turn to 2 stories that illustrate some of these generalities that I've presented. And the first story is a woman whose name is Jolene, her pseudonym. And she's a white woman in her 20s, and she was from a small town on the western side of Michigan. And her story is really about the effectiveness of the reforms in the context of the systemic failure going on around her. She lived with her mom, and her mom was a prostitute who was addicted to a crack cocaine. And Jolene sort of summed up her childhood and said, I seen just a lot of stuff growing up. At age 13, her mother introduced her to crack, and Jolene described that effect, which is, I think it ruined my life. When Jolene was 15, her mother decided to move to Florida. sold most of their belongings, but then after selling her belongings, drove Jolene to Jolene's boyfriend's house and dropped her off and took off for Florida, and that was the end of their relationship. Uh, the boyfriend's mother wanted to help Jolene, but couldn't support her financially. They didn't have that much money. And so Jolene survived by stealing her clothing, shoplifting to meet all her needs, and doing sort of the best she could. And at age 17, she ended up in jail. And she describes with great clarity how sitting in the day room of the jail, women who were quite a bit older than her taught her step by step how to cook meth. And so when she got out, that was a good source of money. And so she started cooking and distributing methamphetamine and using it. So of course, again, she eventually got arrested, back in jail. And she remembered the women talking about how great it was to shoot up drugs and what a great high you got. And she said, well, she got out and she ended up shooting up drugs. And she was on parole, on probation, actually, at that point. And to avoid the costs of paying for her probation supervision, she took off and she was working dancing, and she was making quite a bit of money selling drugs and also dancing. And so she was in the parking lot and she was arrested. She had guns on her. She had drugs and paraphernalia in the car. And that's when she went to prison. And so she was 19 years old in prison. And she said she signed up for all the programming she could because she realized she was going to kill herself in the end with the way she was living. After she left prison, the parole agent did all the right things, got her placed in a 3-month woman responsive drug treatment program in Detroit. And then after that, she went to transitional housing provided by the Department of Corrections. But they kept complaining that whenever she took the bus anywhere in Detroit, she came back late. And the agent went and advocated for her and explained she grew up in a small town in a different place. The bus system was a mess in Detroit. And so, of course, she was late. And so she advocated for her to stay there instead of having her rights to stay there terminated. But it was just very hard for her to live in Detroit. So she moved to the western part of the state, back to her small town. She was kind of doing okay. And then she let her 19-year-old cousin live with her in the hopes that she could get him to stop using drugs. And she was not using drugs at this time, but she was taking a medication called Suboxone, which reduces the sickness you feel when you withdraw from heroin. Her cousin who was living with her stole her rent money. She kicked him out. He overdosed and he died. And she relapsed on heroin because she was so distraught about this. And so she had been working before, but she had a job. So she had been cut from Medicaid. And she was only making $200 a month when she was working. And so being cut from Medicaid meant she couldn't pay the $197 a month for her Suboxone prescription. And she described her situation. If I could get my Medicaid back, I could go back to my Suboxone. When I get back on my Suboxone, my job told me I could have my job back anytime, but I can't because I'm using. And I keep my body normal because I can't keep it normal without my Suboxone. And I don't have Medicaid to get it. So I don't use heroin to get high. I use it to keep well. Otherwise, I can't get out of bed because I'm using. So actually, the story has a pretty good ending. She did return to another program. She found herself in Detroit, and it was a 9-month residential program. And the way I look at it is she kind of had developed recovery capital because her agent had gotten her placed in a good program in Detroit for 3 months and then advocated for her to stay there for a while. Uh, she had the wherewithal to find another good program. And after that, she never did use drugs again. And we did follow all of the women for about 10 years through Department of Corrections records and also through arrest and conviction records that the state maintains. And she apparently never went back to being in trouble with the law again. So this story really shows how the reform worked. Her agent did the right things. Her agent helped her. But at one point, the system totally failed her. And the system is not under the control of the Department of Corrections. It's part of the larger sort of system that should be available to assist people. So I'm going to present the situation now of a very different woman who had a different set of issues. This woman's pseudonym is Raven, and she's a Black woman who lived in a post-industrial city in Michigan, and she was in her late 30s. And for her, in her story, you can really see the connection of race and gender and how it affected her. Most of what her supervising agent did, her probation agent did from Michigan Department of Corrections, was very consistent with the reform effort. But again, there was systemic failure, and she had to cope with extreme economic marginalization. She had used drugs in response to childhood sexual abuse when she was 10 to 15 years old. Her mother's new husband and his son sexually abused her. And the way she described it was, I was raped from 10 to 15. So of course I got high. I did heroin, coke, a lot of drugs. However, she was still using drugs, but she kind of had cut back. And her most recent convictions were for cashing bad checks. And it's very hard to figure out what happened. The first time somebody approached her with some checks that were illegitimate and asked her to cash them. And she admits that that was not a good idea because she didn't really know this person and she just was desperate for money. And so she did cash them. She got caught and she got put on probation. But then the second time, she felt she was wrongfully convicted because she was working in a nursing home and her cousin was working there and her cousin stole money from the nursing home. And yet she was convicted for it. There's no way of my knowing what really happened, but these are nonviolent crimes. And to me, they mostly responded to her economic marginalization. She was supporting 5 children. And because of her probation, she couldn't get a job in the medical field, even though she had been trained as a nurse's aide and to take blood and to do various medical kinds of tasks. Um, she was the way she survived was she lost all of her welfare support and she enrolled in Work First, which was part of the new temporary assistance to needy families, uh, which kind of trains you to show up for work and makes you do resumes and apply for jobs and things like that. And so she went through that program. However, she never was able to get work because her felony record, and there is evidence that particularly Black individuals who have been convicted of crimes have a worse time getting jobs from employers than non-minority people. So she couldn't find work, but she had a new man living with her who paid a lot of the bills, although his employment was kind of tenuous. He worked in construction, so it was sort of seasonal. But that was how she sort of survived. Um, she lived in a neighborhood that was not very good. And again, this is where race comes into play. Black women had a much harder time finding housing in non-high crime neighborhoods than white women. And so her neighborhood was very bad. She talked about bangers. She said she had her children sleep upstairs to avoid stray bullets. She observed her children's friends starting to break the law at a very young age. And she spent most of her day doing very hard work as a mother. To keep her kids from getting into trouble or being harmed in the neighborhood, she described her day-to-day experience. She said, on Mondays, the children go to church from 5 to 9. Tuesdays, they go from 4 to 8. Wednesdays, they go from 5 to 9. Thursdays, they go from 6 to 10. Fridays, they go from 5 to 10:30. Sundays, they go from 9 to 12. Uh, and she, to protect herself and her children in this neighborhood, she spent most of her time in the house. She only left to job search and check her mailbox or walk her children from program to program, basically. Um, so while her agent was helpful, this larger system of total economic marginalization and being confined to a very high crime neighborhood and not being able to find a job in the legitimate economy, despite having gotten quite a few certificates and a fair amount of training, kept her kind of locked in a very difficult situation. However, she also did not recidivate. We have no reason to believe she got back in the system. She eventually got off probation. When I came to trying to write up these stories, what these stories and the other 116 stories told me about policy change, I was totally overwhelmed because there was so much wrong, starting with the juvenile justice system, child protective services. I mean, I could have written a book on all the problems. So what I did after thinking about it for a long time was I thought, well, what did the women recommend? Um, and that's what I focused on in coming up with some policy changes. So I think Jolene has a very good summary of what's needed. She said, looking back, yeah, now if I would have been placed in a placement home or something that gave me resources as how to change my life with the problem that I had with drinking, instead of putting me in jails full of 31-year-olds and 40-year-olds that are there for meth labs, then maybe I wouldn't have gone out and cooked meth. And she went on to say, I feel there just needs to be more resources for the poor. I just think the people that don't have, I guess a lot of support, I think there should just be more opportunity. What do people expect? I mean, they don't want people to use drugs and commit crimes, but then they don't want to give people the resources not to. That doesn't make any damn sense to me. Like they want to punish people for being an addict. Like that's stupid. Um, the I'm going to kind of end with one more quote. One of the interesting things is I had no trouble coming up with a title for this book. A lot of people struggle with titles, but one of the women gave me the title, and nobody ever criticized the title. UCal Press did want to drop the part about neoliberal policies because they said I shouldn't have more than two concepts in the subtitle, which I said you can't because the neoliberal policies are a big problem. And so we were okay. But that was my only title dispute. But the way I got the title was from something that Tina said. And it kind of sums up this whole talk. And here's what Tina said. Looking back at supervision, I think there are some really good people who are probation officers, and I think they're very limited, and they probably become extremely discouraged because they could probably do more to help individuals. But I think they're put in a box, and we were put in a box, and the outcome I don't think was very helpful for anybody. I mean, Agent Laudel will remember because he was really, I could tell he cared. I think given the opportunity, he could have really helped some people. But number one, their loads were overloaded, and they didn't have the time or the resources to help people the way they wanted to. I wasn't just about me. They had limits, courts, and rules. They were just as much boxed in as I was. So the bottom line is the agents could help people address individual challenges like addiction, depression, mental health problems. They can't alter contexts and structures. Despite individual support, many women remained confined in low-resource, high-crime neighborhoods and blocked from employment, and they had no financial means to survive. The typical woman in the study lived on $10,000 or less. And so that's what it means to be in a box, to be in this system. So I'll end there. I'm very interested in reactions and questions and whatever.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morash, for such a powerful talk. I am going to now welcome the audience to post your questions in the chat box. We already have one question as you were presenting, and may I just start, and I'll just probably start with that question. And the question is, what was the duration of the acute phase of the study?
The first interview we did with women to the last was about 7 years. So we were in touch with them for a 7-year period.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And then we followed them in official records afterwards.
May I ask a quick follow-up question to that? Because, this is all very sensitive data, following and, also, I mean, these are lives of people who are already in the system. How did you and your team sort of maintain confidentiality? I mean, for 7 years you were in touch and trying to keep records. So how was confidentiality maintained?
Um, hmm. Well, I mean, at one level, technologically, we used a lot of passwords,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it's a sort of a bane. If I had it to do over, I would use the same password over and over, and we kept changing them, and then we'd forget the passwords and have to remember the passwords. And also, I mean, the IRB here has a very good system. I just discovered they have a new resource which recommends the most secure places to store your data. And it turns out to be OneDrive and Qualtrics. So we used all of those kinds of things. Um, in writing the material, I just left some things were too identifiable. Um, so a lot of the women came from Detroit. So if they were from Detroit, I would name Detroit. But if they were from Flint or Saginaw or Benton Harbor or other what I call post-industrial cities, cities that at especially when we did the first study, the first interviews, we're struggling with recovering from the horrible recession. Um, we just call them post-industrial cities, or, I mean, some women had very unique stories in that, um, and very unique characteristics, and I would just leave those out or slightly change them. Like one woman went to a private school and I didn't mention that. Um, just because she paid for it with drug money that she earned. Um, and that's so unusual
Right.
that, you could tell. And so I just did my best and I also always tried to cite, to make a major point, I tried to cite several women,
Hmm.
which is more to do probably with validity, but also it meant it would be hard to say, oh, I recognize this woman in the book because there were several that had similar experiences. So, does that answer your question? I don't.
Yes, yes, actually, that is very helpful. And this was a question that was not just primarily directed to researchers, but also to many students in our audience, who often, maybe it's the first IRB that they're filling out and all, who kind of struggle. And I think what you've given us are very helpful cues. For example, using our university, drives. That's what we do constantly. We kind of load our information there, password protection, and keeping it within the university data storage system. And I think electronic storage within the university, not on cloud or something, but that SharePoint has been a very good
Mhm.
sort of a thing. And also working with the IRB, I feel like, often, our students often get intimidated by the very idea, oh, we have to answer to the IRB. But I think IRB can be used in a way so that it just protects the study, the participants, and you have kind of demonstrated how it can be done. So thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing is, so because women were on probation and parole, they're considered to be prisoners, even though they're not necessarily in a prison. So there are special requirements
Yeah.
uh, to get that approved.
Yeah, yeah. And also, what you also mentioned, this idea of de-identifying information,
Mhm.
or de-identifying data. This is something that we always teach in our methods class. So you need to de-identify your
Mhm.
data. But exactly what is de-identified? We know the names, the places, and all of that. But even getting into, as you mentioned, if there is a particular case which has a very unique story, right? For example, being in a private school. that, that is clearly an identifying information, right?
Hmm.
Whoever knows the person would know exactly whom they're talking. And I think sort of, taking that information out, or presenting, names of places, in a different way. I think these are very important lessons for researchers to learn
Hmm.
of the study. Okay, so other questions? I am not seeing. Yes, audience, if you could just type, or type out your questions, it'll really help us. Okay, yes, I see another question. Okay, Mary, I'm going to read out the question.
Okay.
During Jolene's story, you said that MDOC is not responsible for the larger problems of the carceral system. Could you please elaborate on that?
Of the carceral system?
Yes. May I? What
Well,
I'll
they
do,
are responsible for that.
I'm going to copy paste the question in our chat box so that everybody can see the question.
Yeah,
I'm not.
they are responsible for the prisons. They are not responsible for the jails. And frankly, women who go to prison have, they don't have adequate access to all the programming they need, but they have much more access to the programming they need and want than women who go to jail. Part of the problem with access to resources in prisons is there's just too many people in prisons. And so there's a shortage. So people have to wait on waiting lists to get into educational programs or mental health treatment, that sort of thing. Um, but it is more available in prisons than jails, and more women go to jail
Hmm.
or have spent time in jail at some point in their lives than go to prison. But I didn't say the entire carceral system. They are responsible for felony, probation, parole, and for the prisons, but they're not responsible for, you know, the
Hmm.
welfare system or the mental health system in the community, which does come into the prison to deliver mental health services.
So there's a response to that, and she writes that I misunderstood. Thank you for clarifying.
Okay.
Okay, our other questions from the audience. I can ask another question if that is okay with everybody. So I actually have two questions from you, Mary. I'm actually fascinated by this term in a box. Because it sounds like it's almost like it's very obvious, but then it kind of fits so beautifully in the kind of this constraints and these dilemmas that these agents or these parole officers are in, and also this the women in the system are in. Uh, could you tell us a little bit more about this concept of in a box, as something, because it captures the situation so beautifully. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, it's constraints. When I teach the theory class, they don't always believe it, but I say you cannot talk about agency unless you also talk about constraints. You cannot talk about constraints unless you talk about agency. And my doctoral students say, oh, yes. Um, but then
And you
I
taught
do
me that
see,
too. And you taught me that too. You cannot
but
talk
I,
about it. Yeah,
I do
yeah.
see that some of them eventually start dealing with that. And that's really what it all means to be in a box. I mean, and I think this idea of bureaucratic activists, I found that, oh gosh, for another book I wrote 15 or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it seems to have disappeared from the literature. I searched when I wrote this book for it, And I think it's very important. There's a lot of criticism of what people in the system do that's wrong, bad, harmful. But I don't think academics fully recognize the reforms that are internally driven. I mean, the director of field services um, once was talking to me about how they had shifted from when people were just totally out of control and they're on probation or parole and they're using drugs and they're really at danger of killing themselves. They used to send them to settings that were run by the Department of Corrections. Uh, but then they shifted from that uh, to sending them to community drug treatment programs, some residential. And his reasoning was the places that had these correction department run settings looked like jails. And if someone's problem is their substance addicted, they shouldn't be there. They should be in a drug treatment program. So, I mean, there are people in the system who try to make change and who do make change, but they can only do so much. I know they have lobbied to get um, people uh, into mental health in the community too, to make women coming out on parole and men a priority, getting continued substance abuse treatment from the community settings, things like that. But they can only do so much. I mean, you know, they can't change the external, and the welfare system is a disaster. They don't pay enough money. It's too hard to get. It's too time limited. Um, it used to be you could get disability for an addiction. That's no longer true. That was changed years ago. And if you don't think being addicted to a drug is a disability, that seems really strange to me. So they just can't change these things. So does that make it?
Yes, yes, yes. Actually,
Mm.
that is such a wonderful way that kind of captures this critique of the system, as well as I was also not familiar with this concept of bureaucratic activists, or
Yeah.
activism, as in, but it's so powerful, and you talk about the system and the changes from within, because we have a tendency, and I'm talking about academics, where we are very critical of the system, and quite rightly so, but we often forget that the system, we have to work with the system, and the system is in place for a certain reason.
Hmm.
Maybe I mean, it shouldn't be in the place that shouldn't be in the way it is now, but I'm kind of increasingly becoming more and more convinced about the systemic changes that
Hmm.
has to happen. And this is probably sort of this critique of this neoliberal policies that you touch upon in
Hmm.
the book. So, yeah.
So
Other
Shoma,
questions?
I'd be
Yeah.
interested if there are no more questions I know that the audience includes people who aren't in criminal justice,
Yeah.
and maybe didn't know some of the things that happen. I'd be interested in audience comments and reactions and suggestions.
That's a good one. Yes, audience. And you can also unmute yourselves. You don't have to type. Unmute yourselves and just talk. Kara, can we do that for the audience?
They should be able to.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi. I'm here for an assignment for my Women and Gender Studies class, and so I just wanted to say I was the one who was asking the question. So if they seemed like someone who didn't know a lot about criminal justice, that's why. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to say this has been really, really illuminating, and I'm looking forward to buying and reading your book because this is something that I've been very interested in for a while, but I don't have a lot of background academic knowledge on. So I just wanted to
Well, thank
say
you.
thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Others? Mary, do you have any, maybe if the audience doesn't have any more questions, do you have any concluding thoughts that the audience may want to take back from this lecture? I know you've said it all, but if there's anything.
Well, I know there are current and future activists in the audience.
Absolutely.
And I guess what I would say is, if you do know of or are an activist, I do have a small grant that I can provide activists with copies of the books. So if you're, for some reason, a probation or parole agent, or please get in touch with me. But the other thing is, it's as you think of, I'd like people to be aware when they hear about welfare cuts, or they hear about the shortage of housing, that's bad and harmful for everybody. But it just adds to a host of harms that people coming out of prisons or people who are addicted to drugs and got entangled in the system. And I think that very rarely gets to legislators. So we have some legislation that has loosened the policies about restricting welfare to people who've been in prison. And finally, they reinstated Pell Grants so people can get money to take courses in prison. But very rarely do major policies really address the needs of and think about the negative impacts on people in this situation.
Thank you, Mary. We have a comment in the chat. Morgan, would you like to read it out? Okay, maybe Morgan is unable to read it out. I'll read it.
No,
Yeah.
she's
Sorry,
just
can you
on.
hear me?
Yes,
I'm a
we
criminal
can.
justice major, and I just thought it was really interesting to learn more about the system and the lack of resources provided from these individuals. And I always think it's interesting to learn and like hear from other people's firsthand experiences. And it just encourages me and like lets me know that, I'm fighting for the right things as I study more and learn more about my major.
Great, future activist.
Wonderful. Other comments?
It is almost 11, so I do want to thank GenCen and you and everyone who's come to hear this talk. And I think unless there's another question posted, I think we can end. Thank you.
Sure. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Morash, for giving us the time to listen to your talk and for coming to the GenCen Colloquium. Oh, we have one more question. May I?
Yeah, go
it's a
ahead.
Okay, so regarding the neoliberal policies portions of your title, can you briefly describe which of these policies you see as most central to this issue?
I'd say it's the safety net idea that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that we're not going to have much government support for them. And that's led to this disaster of available housing, the very restrictive help available for people who are short of funds, the difficulty getting into some kind of disability payments. So I would say that is probably the biggest problem, and it spills over to the lack of funding for mental health services. it's all something to think about with the upcoming election. I won't say more about that, but who is going to protect these policies and who isn't going to protect these policies?